Hello and welcome to News Desk. I'm Alex Forrest-Whiting.
And I'm Jared Reid.
And this week we're talking about unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, known to most of us as drones. Now, they've been around for decades, but in the past few years they've become a game-changing technology, particularly in various conflicts around the world. They're being used by states and non-state actors alike, and they're becoming ever cheaper and increasingly deadly. And that's why this week we're discussing how drones are shifting the power balance in warfare, conflicts and global security.
Which means we definitely want your questions and comments about this topic. We've already had some from our community post that was up over the last day. Our nanny is making the point that the Netherlands very recently pledged 400 million euros in advanced drone development with Ukraine. Now, this is, of course, a rapidly expanding industry and market. And, of course, we're going to be speaking very specifically about this Ukrainian context very shortly and the use of drones in Russia's war there. One Life is saying humans are getting more advanced in war. This is alarming. If countries think they can win by war, it's never ending until complete destruction. Atlas is saying we're inching closer to the point of Horizon Zero Dawn. Do you know what that is, Alex?
I don't actually.
It's a game.
It sounds deadly.
It does. It's a game set in a post-apocalyptic world where the main character uncovers her past while battling robotic creatures and other enemy forces. But this is real. It's not a game, isn't it?
It's not, so it's almost like the gamification
Right.
of war, but as you say, this is real.
So please do, as I say, send in your questions and comments.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jared. And let's just introduce you to who we have around the table, very important people. We've got Pablo Foley-Elias, and Pablo, thank you very much for being with us. You will be helping us with the sort of 101 of what are drones.
Exactly.
And also, as we're having this conversation with our guests who'll be joining us a bit later, maybe you'll bring up a few charts and, I don't know, bits of information that you gather along the way.
Yeah, there's some graphs and some very good pictures and photographs and maps. And
Brilliant.
I'm a big fan of a map.
I'm a big fan of a map, so
yeah,
thank you.
I'll be bringing that in, so to make it a bit more visual.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks for being with us. And also we have somebody that most of you will know from, if you were a fan of News Desk, that's Kerry Chan. Kerry will be with you in the chat, making sure that she's keeping you up to date with who is speaking and also flagging up any good comments. So those, of course, are key to us. Please do keep those comments coming. And we will be joined by two guests down the line a little bit later. The first person is our correspondent out of Ukraine, Nick Connelly. He'll be talking about the so-called drone war that's been going on between Ukraine and Russia over the past 2.5 years, and telling us how that war has been fought using those drones and what perhaps the future looks like with that. And later we'll be speaking to international security expert Dr. Kerry Chavez. She is assistant professor at the US Air Force Academy, and she'll be talking more generally about the role of drones globally and, again, what the future may look like. So thank you very much for joining us, as I said, and we're looking forward to those two guests joining us. And Jared, there's more.
Exactly. This is a really great opportunity for you. If you've got any kind of burning questions about the use of drones in warfare, please do put them in the chat and we'll get them to our guests. But before we do that, Sherry has a poll to kick things off and you can vote on that. Sherry, what have you got for us?
Right. So today we are asking the question, what's your biggest concern about the use of drones in warfare? There are 4 options: the lack of accountability, dehumanization of conflict, targeting mistakes, or the risk of abuse by non-state actors. So please vote, and we will talk about the result later in the stream. And if you have opinions that's beside these 4 options, please write in the comments and we will discuss it in our show.
Brilliant. And definitely put your questions to our guests who will be coming up, as I said. But to kick us off, Pablo, you've got the 101 of drones, yes?
That's right. Well, I had to do a deep dive on drones. And I mean, I think a lot of us know the kind of basics of what a drone is. And the first question I had was, since when have drones been around? And the most fascinating bit of information that I found was actually they date back to the middle, essentially, of the 19th century,
wow,
which was when the unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, were first deployed in combat. All right, and that was done by the Austrians, who were using explosive-laden balloons to attack Venice. Crazy to think in today's day and age to think that the Austrians were attacking Venice, but that's what happened. And what happened was that they weren't very, let's say, I'm trying to think of a good word. They weren't the best at doing what they had to do, and because of the wind, because they were balloons, they ended up blowing back into Austria, so they didn't really...
They weren't so sophisticated back then.
Weren't sophisticated back then. We then have to go to the First World War, where we began to really see sort of the development of drones take place. The first pilotless vehicles began to be developed by the British and the Americans. They weren't used, though, operationally in combat during the war back in the First World War. It was then in the interwar period, so 1918 to 1939, where we saw that development take place. And interestingly, where the word drone began to be used. And that was because of the British, who had developed one type of unmanned aerial vehicle, which was the DH-82B Queen Bee. So that was where they got the name drone, and that was when we started using this term. Radio-controlled drones were also manufactured in the United States, but actually the first time that we saw surveillance drones being used, we have to go to the Vietnam War of the 1960s, 1970s. And then since then, we've really seen sort of the development of UAVs and drones in general. They've been used as decoys in combat, surveillance we've seen, but it's really in the past few years, particularly, say, the last decade or so, where we're really seeing this sort of shift in how often we're seeing drones being used, and as well how they're being used in wars. Obviously, the war in Ukraine is the one where we've really sort of come into consciousness of their use. I've got actually a picture that I want to just show you guys. It'll Michelle will bring it up. Here it is, and it's just showing some of the types of drones that are being used. Now, obviously, there's differences in size there. I don't know, you can barely even see it, but there up in the top left of the photograph, you can actually see these very small little drones. And you'll often see these small little drones being used in surveillance, for example. They've even been used, they've been tested, I know, in Spain and other countries by doctors to bring medication to... Exactly. So they're used for different reasons. Then, of course, you've got these big long-range drones, that big one there on the left-hand side. Ukraine is using that one. So the colours, I should explain. The purple are drones that are used in Ukraine, by the Ukrainians, and the orange is used by the Russians. The one on the far right, I don't want to go into huge levels of detail about the different types of drone yet, because obviously we have our guests for that too. But the Shahed drone here on the far top right, that's an Iranian-made drone which the Russians are using. That can travel up to 1,000 kilometres. Wow. And these are drones that are now being used in combat, essentially, and, you know, are pretty dangerous vehicles that we're seeing. Also, add into that, what I think I need to talk about is how they're used, because I think often there are questions about, well, how are they? Who controls the drones? So we have first person...
Sorry, and just before you talk about that, I do just find it amazing, just the difference in the size of these drones. Like you pointed to the top left corner.
I didn't realise...
You can barely even see them.
You can barely see it. And then you've got that huge
ones.
one.
I didn't even realise some of them got as big as they did. That's like a
that
kind
big
of
one
like
there
a glider.
is the Bayraktar one, which is a Turkish-made drone.
Okay.
Quite a lot of drones are actually made in Turkey, and I'll be discussing that as well a little bit later on. So the Shahed, the one which I mentioned on the far right, that's an Iranian-made drone. And the thing is as well, what we're seeing is that drones in some ways can be quite cheap to make as well. It depends the level of sophistication, of course, that we're talking about, but obviously very effective. Depending on the size as well, they can evade a lot of the radar systems. So this is a very sophisticated tool that's now being used. The question I was going to get to is how are they operated, of course. So you have the first-person view, FPVs. They're controlled by pilots. They're controlled by pilots on the ground, and their job is often that they crash into targets. They're often laden with explosives. And basically what you have is that you will have someone with a headset, and they'll be able to see exactly where the drone is going. You have someone next to them who is essentially guiding them if they have a specific target.
So like a two-person job. One's
exactly.
sort of got the map and the other one's driving
It's
the
telling
thing.
them, right, go left, whatever. And of course, these are much more, they can really find a target much better than, say, artillery can. So that's why we're seeing these being used quite a lot. Add to that now AI, of course.
And we'll be talking...
And we'll be talking about that too.
later.
So, you know, these are very specific tools that can be used as well for reconnaissance, surveillance, and targeted attacks. Yeah. And they also do have a positive focus. We should also mention that, you know, they're used to, for example, in if there's some sort of natural disaster, the drones are being used as well. Surveillance of areas, photography, you know, there are many positive ways that we can use drones too. So, you know, we shouldn't forget that too.
Thank you very much, Pablo. That's great.
You mentioning this combination or this, with AI, Max Zebel has written in the chat, this is a concerning development as the rise of artificial intelligence will make them independent, avoiding signal jammers, but also transferring to decisions to algorithms and pattern recognition. And I think this is something that our expert, Kerry Chavez, will be able to talk about a little bit later. So if you have any follow-up questions for her about this, please do put them in.
But let's bring in our first guest, and that is Nick Connelly. Nick is a correspondent for DW based out of Kyiv in Ukraine, and a familiar face, of course, on DW, a familiar face to News Desk. We're always very grateful to have Nick with us. So thank you very much, Nick. Out there in the cold, so well, hopefully it's not too cold. It's looking very beautiful, though, behind you, Nick. So great to have you. We are talking, as you know, about drones, and this has been a very key part of the Ukraine war between Ukraine and Russia, so much so that it has been nicknamed the drone war. How important, or can you just sort of give us a basic understanding of just how important drones, the important part that drones have been playing in that war from both sides?
Look, I think seen from Kiev, you can say that drones have pretty much given Ukraine a chance at some kind of victory, or at least holding this war in the kind of current paradigm that it's in. You've seen Ukraine that basically doesn't have a functioning navy anymore, being able to push Russian ships out of Crimea, basically out of the western half of the Black Sea with sea drones. On the battlefield, we've seen Ukraine time and time again come up with innovations that have caught the Russians off guard, and it's taken time for the Russians to then adapt and copy those kinds of ideas. Often enough, Russia then able to produce the same kind of things that Ukraine is doing at a bigger scale later on, but Russia doesn't have the kind of volunteer startup kind of ecosystem that Ukraine has. So it has been crucial, and you know, in a situation where Ukraine is so dependent on Western weapon supplies that often come much later, drones are something that you can build yourself. You can buy spare parts, you can buy drones from eBay or from the kind of Chinese marketplaces. You can put them together, add a grenade that was somewhere in a store cupboard for the last 30 years, and create a weapon that is pretty effective and is able to protect Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefield. So it has been massive, and you really notice that even the Ukrainian military that is seeing all this happen in its ranks, the kind of top brass still don't really get it, aren't, if you talk to soldiers, putting enough money into this. And it's basically soldiers on the front lines who are kind of crowdsourcing all this money and fundraising to create these weapons.
In a moment, we will look at some of your own footage that you filmed on the front line with some of these drone pilots. But first of all, we've got a map, which hopefully Pablo can bring up. It's from Reuters, and it shows reported drone attacks in the war. I don't know if you can see this, actually, Nick, but just so I can spell it out to you.
I can.
You can, great. So the purple dots there are Ukraine strikes, or reported Ukraine drone strikes, and the orange are reported Russian strikes. It looks to me from here like a pretty equal match in terms of how many reported strikes there have been. What does it say to you?
Look, I think these are probably the bigger strikes, especially the kind of ones using the kind of more long-distance drones. And then, you know, it's often difficult to say what is a drone strike, right? Because you have a reconnaissance drone that finds a target, and then more traditional weapons are used, ballistic missiles, to hit those targets. So it's kind of difficult to say. But largely the dynamic of this war has been Ukraine pioneering these weapons, especially the kind of longer distance drones, and then Russia basically following course and trying to adapt these systems to their own kind of military system. Obviously, they've got the Iranian drones as well, those Shahed drones that have been pretty effective and that basically, reach Kiev, where I am now, pretty much every night. Last night, I heard them being shot down over Ukraine's capital. So I think for now, Ukraine is holding its own. In terms of sheer numbers, probably Russia's still able to field more. But Ukraine has done a lot in terms of sharing information between different military units, using intelligence that it's getting from the West to try and make every drone count and to kind of compensate for its lack of material compared to the Russian side. And it's certainly something where I think Ukrainians just feel like this is something that we can actually affect and do something about, whereas developing a new ballistic missile will take years, if not decades. These are the kind of things that can really be improved on and changed in a matter of weeks and months.
And how have drones changed in the course of this war? Because we have seen some very different types from what we saw at the beginning, haven't we?
Exactly. So, the Bayraktar drones from Turkey that Pablo just mentioned, those are basically gone now. They are too slow, too expensive, and too easily shot down. They were a huge deal in the first few months. We had lots of videos doing the rounds in Ukraine from those huge groups of Russian soldiers heading towards Kiev being attacked by those Bayraktar drones. And they've now been replaced by, on the one hand, these cheaper FPV drones that are basically, that's a one-way weapon. This is something that costs maybe, 600, 700, 800 euros to put together, if that. And then you've got the reconnaissance drones up in the sky that are often, if they're lucky, can survive for months, if not years, without being shot down, that are coordinating all that. So you've got those two things. But then the biggest problem of all is electronic warfare. Russia has a very significant capability, is able to basically cut off the drones from their operators. And most cases, if the drones don't have that connection to their operator, they just get lost or they return to where they came from. And now increasingly you're seeing drones that are using technology basically to compare a map that's been uploaded to the drone, and then by the kind of visual kind of orientation to then compare what it's seeing underneath it with those maps to then be able to autonomously get to its target, even if that connection to the operator has been lost.
I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? The way that the whole drone scene is changing and developing literally as we speak. And we will certainly be talking a little bit about this later with our expert who'll be joining us from the US. Just talking about one particular drone before we look at the pictures that you yourself filmed. But these so-called Dragon drones that we have been hearing about that are dropping this incredibly hot molten metal, spitting it out. We've got some pictures here, spitting it out, burning it 4,400 degrees Fahrenheit. That's almost 2,500 degrees Celsius. Basically, trying to flush out hiding soldiers by burning out the foliage and ruining their cover, because I guess many soldiers on both sides are trying to take cover from drones in these forests, Nick.
Well, that's the case, and you've increasingly seen along the front lines soldiers on both sides basically doing their best to spend as little time as possible above ground, because they know that every movement is going to be seen. And it really has forced people deep underground, and you're seeing those trenches getting deeper by the year. They're also being built in a more sophisticated way, so whereas before it was deemed to be enough to basically be underground, have a bit of soil above you, and have enough kind of reinforced walls to deal with the impact from an artillery shell. Now you're having increasingly these kind of maze-like underground fortifications built, because the drone can fly down into the entrance of the trench and follow the soldiers as they run away from the drone. So that is that is something
terrifying. Sorry, Nick, and you were just talking about it, but we have got these pictures that you yourself filmed, I think it was back in December, of these trenches yourself, which hopefully we can bring up in a moment. But you've been there yourself, and here we're seeing those pictures, and we're looking at pictures, for example, I think that's a surveillance drone, so
right.
A pilot looking at some of the pictures that they're seeing, and this is somebody putting a drone together, Nick, and I don't know if you're able to see this, but these are the pictures these are the pictures that you filmed. So what's it like in those trenches with these soldiers and what they are trying to do?
So this was December of last year. So since then, obviously, there's been a lot more in the way of innovation since then. That was near Avdiivka in the east of Ukraine. And you can see just from the cable ties and just quite how cheap and primitive those weapons look. These are weapons that are put together pretty much on the front lines. Even the explosives, the crew we were there with were saying that they produce their own explosive because what they get from the army kind of logistics just doesn't work. So they have kind of adapted these systems for what they have seen to work. And often enough, they obviously get lost because, you have this kind of human element. You've got the surveillance drone pilot telling the other person where to go. And in a kind of lunar landscape where everything's been destroyed, all the trees have been basically knocked down, often enough, it's difficult to really tell where you're going when everything's covered in snow. And we were there following them and seeing them losing drones, losing contact to drones because of electronic warfare, and also attacking Russian positions.
And just quickly, just how cheap are those drones that you're talking about then? Like you're saying they're pretty much putting them together in those trenches.
I mean, certainly. I mean, these are weapons that can be produced for under €1,000. Definitely, it depends on what kind of, grenade or what kind of explosives you're adding there. If you're adding night vision cameras or other kind of elements to kind of protect them from Russian electronic warfare. But these are weapons that are often significantly cheaper than one single artillery shell, because even these kind of very basic military supplies like artillery shells have the prices just exploded in, I mean, sorry for the bad metaphor there, but they really have, gone out of anything that people could have expected because of the huge demand from Ukraine. And so, even if the military wants to order shells from other countries, often enough the production is just too slow, and you have people buying these drones that were previously derided as being basically a toy, something to film wedding videos on, and buying them in huge numbers from China, from other East Asian producers, and then putting them together here.
Nick, it's Jared here. It's really interesting how you're talking about, I guess, this obvious demand in Ukraine for these drones, but it seems to me that a lot of the know-how, the innovation and the knowledge of how to adapt drones right now is coming from Ukraine. This is, I guess, a key kind of development in, I guess, the global drone industry, if you like.
And certainly, if you're here in Kiev and you go to any kind of defence events or press events, any kind of conferences, it is a city that is full of European, other Western defence contractors, companies trying to get that knowledge, testing their systems, often enough handing over bits of kit to the Ukrainians in the hope that they can really test them in a real war. Often enough, the stuff that has been produced for Western militaries at huge expense over many years doesn't cut the mustard because Russia can do so much to block signal and other things. So this is obviously the place, the conflict where this is really being developed at the kind of at the fastest rate anywhere. And I think there's an expectation that after this war, Ukraine will come out of this war with a big, high-tech defense sector because, these are the people who know how to make it work. But, the kind of problem that still remains, and you hear a lot of criticism all the time here in Ukraine from soldiers, from activists, that, even 2.5 years into this war, the government doesn't really get it and prefers to buy expensive, complicated drones in small quantities rather than providing soldiers with the thousands, hundreds of thousands or millions of drones that they say they need.
But, I mean, these drones, the cheaper drones that you're talking about, I mean, they must be literally at the whim of cold weather, of short battery life. I mean, how easy is it for example, for the soldiers that you were filming with, for them to actually hit their targets, be able to carry out their surveillance, their reconnaissance with those drones, if they're working in very cold, difficult weather conditions?
Well, exactly. These aren't very sophisticated weapons. These are drones that anyone can pretty much buy in any country online for a couple of €100 without the weapons. In terms of the cold, that is very bad for the batteries, and so you have kind of pharmacy-bought heat packs that people normally use for back pain being used to warm them up before they're sent out. They don't do very well when it's too windy or when the rain is too strong. So these are not military-grade weapons, but because they are so cheap and because there are so many of them, they can do lots of things that the kind of more professional kit can't.
And you talked earlier about how both sides are trying to stop drones from affecting them, from hitting their targets. You were talking about electronic warfare. against drones. And I guess that means things like signal jamming. But how is that actually working on the ground?
Well, when you speak to Ukrainian soldiers, they will often say that it is a constant kind of game of cat and mouse, that every time they change the frequencies they use to communicate with their drones, that then certain couple of weeks later the Russians will have blocked that too, and they keep on having to change them, having to use drones then that kind of are more or less autonomous once they've been launched to avoid that. So it is clear that you can't use the drones we've seen in that report from December 23 are very unlikely to be effective now, almost a year down the line. It is a constant kind of search for those alternatives. We've had stories of land drones that are now increasingly used that are just connected to basically by cable, so they don't rely on wireless communications. They just send out a land drone, which basically is a kind of machine going on wheels on a long cable, and that avoids then the other side trying to impede signals. So it is a kind of sector where we're seeing a huge amount of change. But the fact is still that basically along the front lines now, you are constantly being watched by drones, and that has really changed fundamentally how soldiers on the battlefield behave.
And Pablo, you've got some pictures, I think, haven't you?
That's right. I've got some photographs of the different ways that these drones are being essentially stopped from doing their job. So we're seeing here, this is a Ukrainian-made device. It costs around 10,000 euros to make. And basically what it does is that it uses directed radio waves to overwhelm the connection with the drone. So that's there's one example. I mean, it's pretty fascinating when I start looking at all the different ways. There's another example. This is called an anti-drone backpack, which also jams devices. That was being used in Lviv. And Nick could probably give us more different ways of how they have to deal with the interception of drones, because essentially what they're doing is, with some of the drones, obviously, that have a connection with, say, what we were talking about before, directly with people who are manning them, they're obviously easier to intercept, but if there's a specific target, it's much more difficult. So those Iranian-made drones, for example, which have a specific target, they are apparently more difficult to stop.
Nick, I don't know if you were able to see what Pablo was showing us with just some of the, for example, the jamming device. Is this something that you have seen yourself on the ground?
I mean, certainly you see cars, military, but also, sometimes government organisations, civilian government kind of officials driving around with jamming equipment on the roofs of their Jeeps to prevent something hitting them, prevent an FPV drone getting them. And it also has to be said that, these are not without risk for people inside, right? There is still not that much evidence and experience is being gathered, but people are worried about the health effects of basically having these very strong antenna around you. Some people have said, maybe this could be comparable to, the effect of X-rays or whatever. We don't have the science and the kind of findings yet, but it is something that doesn't come without a cost. And then, as we also saw in those pictures from Pablo, you have those directed weapons that you can use to target a specific drone that you can, is there or you can see coming. There are lots of videos on Ukrainian social media of cars driving away at speed from drones, trying to kind of hide under trees in the hope that the drone will crash in to the branches and not reach its target. So it is a kind of a new world basically, where people are trying to work out how to do this without too much damage to themselves and without kind of making it impossible to do their jobs.
It's interesting you say that, because we have a comment from Finn Fine. The conflict, this is sort of linked to what you just said there, Nick. The conflict is a testing ground for the technologies of war, and I guess we're seeing that really in practice here. What I kind of was interested, Nick, do we have any idea how many drones are being used on a daily basis in Ukraine, or how many drones are operational at any one time?
I think those numbers are normally secret. No one has really, that I've seen in kind of open source information, talked about that. There was a government program, or still is a government program, to produce 1 million drones a year. That is of the kind of, largely the FPV drones, but I think that number might not actually be enough, because you have lots of constant kind of fundraising going on here. People collecting money for whole sections of the army units, even people they know. You have individual soldiers asking for money online on their social media from their friends to buy drones. So this is a huge effort, and at the kind of most basic, it doesn't take a huge amount of technical experience to make something that can change the situation, can make you a bit safer, or can give you better awareness of what's happening around you. So this is kind of still fairly unregulated, and lots of kind of people doing things, experimenting on the side. I think the other thing, kind of when you look at the maps, one thing that kind of a thought that came to my mind is that often enough when you talk about the range of these weapons, it's important to say also that they're flying very intricate kind of patterns. So if they're going 100 kilometers as the crow flies across the border into Russia, say from Ukraine, they're often flying many times more that to get around the radar, to get around air defense systems. So this is something that is often pretty unexpected. You'll be here in Kiev, and the drones will have flown a very long way over Russia, sometimes dipping into Belarus, coming back to Kiev. So these are very difficult to intercept, because even if you know where they're coming from, their routes are often pretty unexpected.
Nick, thanks so much for joining us. We're going to let you go for now, because I know it's quite chilly where you are standing. It would be great if you could join us a little bit later. Don't disappear altogether, because we'd really like to bring in our next guest now. That is Dr. Kerry Chavez. She is Assistant Professor in the Military and Strategic Studies Department at the United States Air Force Academy. She's also an advisor for Project Air and Space Power at the Irregular Warfare Initiative, and a non-resident research fellow with the Institute for Global Affairs. In fact, I think her biography is actually longer than that, but that's a short version. So thank you very much. And Jared, we've got something important to add.
We have some formalities to get out the way before we get to you, and that comes in the form of this disclaimer. The views that Dr. Chavez expresses are hers and do not reflect the official position of the US Air Force Academy or the US Department of Defense. With that out the way, now we can get to the questions.
We can
Dr.
ask you
Chavez.
anything now, can't we? Kerry. No, we don't. We're sticking
Ask
to
me
drones,
anything.
don't worry. We've talked, as you were probably hearing, we were talking there with Nick Connelly, our DW correspondent in Kyiv, talking about the crucial role that drones have been playing in the Ukraine war. Can you just talk us through in very basic terms how diverse drones are generally, not just being used in Ukraine, but being used everywhere, just so we have an idea? We've talked a little bit about it with our reporter, Pablo, who had some pictures where he was able to show us the difference in size. But we also have a graphic or a graph that you sent me that we can show, that you could just talk through and explain the different types of drones. That we just will bring that up shortly on page 11, I think it is. It should just be coming up.
Yes.
Issues.
There it is. There it is.
There we go.
Your team has actually done a wonderful job sketching this drone diversity. So commendations to Pablo and also to Nick for covering that. And Nick is right that there is a significant application of size. And that's originally how most scholars and policymakers and practitioners were looking at it, is size. But with the use of these tactical UAS or UAVs in the Russia-Ukraine theater, and that has now diffused into a lot of other theaters, I think probably a better maybe metric is capacity, because there are quite small tactical UAS that are loaded with sophistication now. And previously it was the case that the small UAS were these commercial variants or analogs, and they mostly were the complete opposite of the heavy stealth military grade ones that are optimized and integrated and harmonized for exquisite uses. So it was a lot simpler before, when you had states flying these advanced military grade craft, and then you had the non-state actors or the terrorist organizations flying these, child's toys for the most part. But now that the tactical UAS has really exploded in the Russia-Ukraine war, we're seeing more about capacity. And I think that that's important for us to talk about when it comes to how this is changing global conflict and security. But they've done a wonderful job talking about the cost, the scarcity of the more expensive ones, the disposability of the cheaper ones, and how that can lead to the democratization of these platforms to the unit or the foot soldier, rather than being used at a higher operational or strategic level of war.
So going back then to that graphic that we just put up, you're saying then it's not so much focus on those stealth ones, those ones at the very top, but it's lower down that pyramid. I don't know if we can bring that picture up again.
Yeah.
Hang on one second. We just try and find. There it is. So you're talking, if you can see this, Kerry, are you talking then about the blue then? I can't quite read that, but what does that say,
Stealth
Pablo?
combat.
No, the dark blue.
The dark blue.
The dark blue. Is that the
military and commercial?
Mid-size military.
The mid-size. Is that what you're talking about when you are saying for the foot soldiers, or are you talking about those hobbyist drones?
So I am at this point talking about that lowest green tier, which before, as this graphic is a bit dated, before those reflected non-military grade variants that violent non-state actors were turning to. Now we're finding that both advanced, powerful states are using them, and they're adding capabilities, they're enriching them aftermarket. We call those hybrid versions, such that there is a blurring between military and commercial technology in the militarization of drones.
Got it.
So it's gotten more complicated.
Yeah, OK. And one other thing I wanted to ask you, you said exquisite use. What do you mean by exquisite use of drones? What does that mean in layman's terms?
Yeah, so we're talking about these very advanced platforms that are laden with sophistication and optimized, ruggedized, for instance, to be used in the cold, standardized so that they're highly reliable. And those ones are the more scarce, expensive versions. Exquisite is kind of a synonym in the military world for those advanced military grade, the highest tier of something relative to kind of the rickety hobbyist versions that are less reliable, as Nick was talking about.
And maybe, Pablo, we can just bring up that the graphic that we had before, the one that you were showing, the Reuters picture. With the different types as well. That would be good. Yeah, so that's very interesting, particularly as you're saying that, you know, there's this sort of crossover, the hybrid use of these drones. How would you say drones then generally are changing conflicts, not just Ukraine, but around the world? How are they now being used, not just in conflicts, but in security generally? Originally, these were platforms just for counterterrorism for the most part, and they have a lot of pros, a lot of assets for that, especially because in counterterrorism, you have these decentralized organizations, and combatant identification is very difficult when they embed in a civilian population. So they were really useful to loiter and gather intelligence and for precision in those theaters and for risk aversion for the deploying state. And although in total war and in some other conflict theaters, that hasn't changed that much in the sense that those strategic ones, those large, expensive, heavy ones that are scarcer are being used for high-value targets and for strategic targets. So that could be something logistical or maybe a central rear headquarters that's a center of gravity for a military force. Where this has really changed is once violent non-state actors took up the commercial variants. And this started back in 2012, 2013, when the commercial industry really started normalizing and cascading into society. And that granted organizations that previously had no reliable air power a very crude air force. And it extended their reach, their lethality. It enabled them to perform operations with more risk aversion. And in a lot of ways, it kind of closed the parity gap that they struggle against stronger combatants. And then with the Russia-Ukraine war, now in many other theaters and many other strong states as well, are starting to assimilate these small UAS because they saw how effective they were. And
in the Ukraine theater in particular, it's allowed those foot soldiers or those ground units to turn into what we call island force structures. Their command and control is not so dependent on the higher operational combatant commands. And that changes how they can move and shoot and communicate. It gives them much more autonomy in the field. And from there, as we've seen it in other theaters, particularly in Gaza, we're being able to learn how effective they are in subterranean and also urban environments, or in these built-up environments that can often be very canalized, can constrict movement very much. And by sending a UAS in first to survey, sometimes to provide communication relays because of the electronic warfare that is often dense in these areas, we're seeing incredible threat thickness in what's called the air littoral, or the kind of the tactical canopy of airspace. So in a lot of theaters, it's creating that dense air littoral, and there's not a lot of aerial infrastructure or counter UAS tools that are trying to catch up to this phenomenon. So you're seeing a sort of offensive dominance. You're seeing weaker actors capable of attacking with a combat power that they haven't had before, and from an aerial vector that they've never been able to leverage.
Yeah. It's fascinating. I mean, just talking about these non-state actors, I wanted to just look at an example, a very recent example in the past few days, Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah is an Iran-backed militant group in Lebanon. It is, I guess, it is a non-state actor, although we all know that it also has very significant control over Lebanon, both politically and within the social structure. We're looking at pictures here of the aftermath of an attack from Hezbollah. It was a drone attack which hit an Israeli army base, killing 4 Israeli soldiers and injuring dozens more. This was in northern Israel. This drone apparently undetected, and that is despite Israel having an enormous military, this Iron Dome, a very expensive air defence system. So many questions are thrown up with this particular attack. The main one being, how was it not detected?
Right.
How could all, with that huge Iron Dome, have been talked about certainly over the past year, but we all know Israel has this huge air defensive system. How did just a drone like that manage to get through, hit its target and kill 4 Israeli soldiers and injure many more?
It's a great question. So Iron Dome's target acquisition algorithms, or the way that it identifies a target to intercept, they are mostly designed for missiles, incoming rockets and missiles, which move at a much faster velocity than most drones, and also tends to take a ballistic trajectory. So Iron Dome was designed to intercept a different platform, and that's why the advent of drones has been more challenging for it to recalibrate. And they have intercepted UAS in the past, but these days, again, that the density of what's happening in the airspace, it may challenge even these very sophisticated defense architectures, aerial architectures, to be successful. In this particular case, what I understand is that Hezbollah did send in a drone, and they, being lower, slower, and able to kind of modulate their speed, they can evade the target acquisition, and it takes more manual oversight to detect them. But I also understand that Hezbollah sent a cluster or a swarm of rockets to overload those target acquisition algorithms, such that Iron Dome didn't detect it on the side. And these types of sophisticated sort of combined attacks are not uncommon, even among the violent non-state actor world. I think it's also possible, given how beset Israel has been with 2 war fronts, that they might be getting short on interceptors, and they're having to decide when and where to deploy them in defense.
And what are the strategic and geopolitical implications of an attack like this? Because it clearly was not expected by Israel.
I think perhaps this particular attack wasn't expected by Israel, but attacks like this probably are well on their radar. But Israel is fighting on two fronts, two very different fronts against two different actors. At the beginning of the Gaza conflict, there was some statistics spouted by experts that fighting in Gaza or fighting Hamas for 10 days was the equivalent of fighting Hezbollah for one, just because of Hezbollah's capabilities. But over the past year, Israel has been degrading Hezbollah's capabilities with attacks like the pager explosions, decapitation attacks, which is when you target leaders in an organization to hopefully destabilize the pockets beneath. And Hezbollah has lost a lot of its capability from the last year. So I think this attack, which there are speculations, some experts say that this was an Ababil drone, which is an Iranian military-grade drone, but some experts are saying that the technical specifications also correlate with a Russian drone, the Orion. And so the provenance of that drone could have some strategic implications if Russia is directly supporting Hezbollah, which they've shared a war theater in Syria in the civil war. They fought alongside one another. So that wouldn't be watershed, but it would suggest that Hezbollah has been attrited enough that they are not able to be sufficiently supported by Iran and are having to stretch further, and that we have this access, this coalition between Russia, Iran, which are sharing technology, and now Hezbollah working together. So we have to keep track of that.
Professor, it's Jared Reed here. I wanted to read out a comment from our chat. You just mentioned swarms a little bit earlier. Max, who we had a little bit earlier, he wrote again, small drones have demonstrated high positional precision in peaceful light shows. That's an example he gave. And he says, if armed and made autonomous in conflicts, swarms could be highly effective in covering or holding entire regions. What do you have to say to that?
Swarms, so he's talking about a pre-programmed configuration, and that's certainly a concern, especially if they're pre-programmed. You can't intercept a signal between a platform and a pilot. So some of the counter-UAS techniques would be ineffective against that, but others would be effective. There's quite a large ecology of counter-UAS options out there. But it is a concern if you pre-programmed a swarm. There was the three sort of middle military grade drones that a few years ago were sent to the Iraqi prime minister's house were pre-programmed. So they were what we call darkened, and they weren't able to intercept them with jamming techniques. Right. So that's another example of a malicious use. But the technology is still in research and development for true swarming. So we do have examples, including from violent non-state actors, of multiple humans piloting multiple craft in tandem such that they appear to swarm organically, but they're actually just individually operated. And sometimes that does more successfully penetrate aerial defense, just the mass aspect. But true swarms where the platforms have emergent learning through artificial intelligence and they respond to one another in sort of unforeseen, surprising ways. It's beyond their explicit programming because they respond to their environment and to one another in real time. That has not yet been actualized in modern warfare. It's, of course, something that people who study emerging technologies like me are watching. But I don't think that capability is imminent because it is quite sophisticated and it will remain constrained to the most advanced actors. And I think also it will remain constrained by human choice. It's not technological determinism that it will automatically be used in the worst case scenario. So we have to remember that this is a socio-technical thing and humans are making choices and there are normative ethical dimensions.
You talked about violent non-state actors using drone warfare. We were talking there about Hezbollah a little bit earlier. But it's not just Iran-backed militant groups, is it? It's not just Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthi rebels. There are other groups that are using drone warfare.
That's exactly right. That was the conventional wisdom at first, that this was just an Iran-backed jihadist phenomenon in the Middle East. But I did an empirical examination, and at the end of 2019, I had a count of, I think, approximately 60 mid-60s groups, and very diverse groups across every continent except Antarctica. So this is not just constrained to state-sponsored groups. This is something that does not require a high financial or technical or organizational capacity. A lot of groups have seen the demonstration points by fellow non-state actors and now by states in the Russia-Ukraine theater, in Israel. So there are several theaters that are dense with violent non-state actor drone use. Any interested viewers should look at Burma, which is surprisingly one of the most drone dense on both sides of the conflict, but it's being used in many places in Africa. There is a UNIDIR report that explains how this is really starting to heat up in Africa. They're prolifically used by transnational criminal organizations, by gangs, by cartels. So the whole spectrum of violent non-state actors are leveraging these for multi-use applications, from intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, smuggling, distraction, disruption, weaponization of different kinds, command and control, propaganda and aerial photography. So it is quite diverse, the way they're being deployed by violent non-state actors, and it's exponentially increasing.
So I mean, from what you're saying then, which does sound quite scary, could this lead to drone terrorism? Is that what we could be seeing over the next few years?
It has led to drone terrorism in many places, unfortunately. And that's one of the concerns. Places like Israel that have that native or inbuilt aerial defense, they have an advantage, but that most of the world has never had to secure from the air. So you have just kind of a ubiquitous landscape that violent non-state actors could target should they choose. And there are a lot of initiatives that global policymakers and security providers are mounting to overcome this defensive deficit. So I know the UN is looking at it. NATO is looking at it. A lot of militaries are considering it. Next week, the Global Counterterrorism Forum is hosting a dialogue to continue talking about how terrorists are using these disruptive technologies, focusing on drones and artificial intelligence. So there's a lot of security providers that are trying to stay on the leading edge of this threat, but it is coming fast, and it came somewhat unexpectedly because of the developments in the commercial industry that they kind of outstripped the military industrial complex. And so we're in this difficult stage right now. I think for the long term, we will figure this out. But right now, we have a lot of unsecured areas, and we have a lot of opportunities for violent non-state actors to turn to this. So that's a lot of what I examine in my research. And I do things like wargaming, red teaming exercises to understand how those violent non-state actors might target things like population-centric zones or sensitive infrastructure in urban environments, things of that nature.
Gosh, it does sound terrifying. On Dr. Kerry Chavez, just stay with us a moment. We want to talk about the ethical side of all this in a second. But first of all, Cherry, how is the chat? What's going on? Are there any particular themes that are coming out of it?
Yeah, I have to say there are some comments that I feel really identified with, that I think they're speaking my mind. For example, Rastus says that absolutely terrifying how efficiently we are able to kill each other. And Max Siebel, that we quote earlier, says, if you had shown me these drone examples and images some decade ago, I would have deemed them to be from a set dystopian sci-fi movie. I have to say, I feel the same way. I find it really shocking how we're using drones in warfare, and I find it quite scary and surreal, like what our viewers think.
Yeah, I think we all feel like that.
Yeah, it's very kind of worrying. I noticed Carolina here is also asking whether, you know, in the future, are we just going to be relying on solely drones for military exercises? I mean, maybe that's something we can talk about, where this is all headed.
Yeah, definitely.
One thing I just wanted to put there, it's just from my own research, and as well what Dr. Chavez is saying there, as well as I've just seen how it's really sort of pardon the pun, exploded in the past few years, particularly with regards to the number of countries that are now using certain types of drone. And actually, just as a graph I've just pulled up here, which is just showing the year and all the countries that are using these medium altitude, long endurance UAVs. So they're maybe Dr. Chavez can explain more exactly what that is. But we're seeing sort of what's surprising to me is that, you know, we're seeing countries like the United States, UK, Israel, China, but then we're seeing also other countries in there that perhaps, you know, are not big military powers as well now using drones. So it's sort of this sort of, as we've been talking throughout, this more accessible tool for armies and as well non-state actors as well.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Let's bring back Nick Connelly, who was hopefully is back outside in Kyiv. Hopefully you're not too cold. Can't see him yet, but also we see Dr. Kerry Chavez from the US Air Force Academy. Hi, Nick. We can see you both. That's brilliant. I wanted to talk to you both just about what's sort of underlying all of this, the human and the ethical costs of drone strikes, cheap to kill, mistakes happen. And I want to just focus on one particular example, a massive US blunder in Afghanistan back in August 2021. It was the last US drone strike in Afghanistan before the US withdrew from the country. And we can look at some pictures now, which we can put up in the aftermath of this US drone strike, where we can see exactly what happened. Innocent people were killed. We've got some pictures which hopefully we can show in a second, but they have got smoke. Here we are, smoke from the US drone strike. It hit a car. It didn't just kill one wrong person, it killed several, including 7 children. And let's just hear what this eyewitness saw.
Suddenly, the sound of mortars came, and it was very dangerous. When we came here, the cars were on fire and some children had died, and their hands and faces were burnt.
So that was an eyewitness there to that attack in August 2021 in Afghanistan, a US drone that was launched. Pretty horrific. It did take the US military several weeks before they admitted it was a mistake and they apologised. But Kerry, if I can come to you first, I mean, this can't be the only time that the wrong targets are hit and that we get these terrible, deadly mistakes that happen by performed by countries such as the US and of course others around the world.
It's certainly not the only time, and drones are not a panacea. They are capable of discrimination and precision beyond most platforms, but people make mistakes, errors occur, and truthfully sometimes abuses occur. And we should keep in mind that they aren't a pure solution or a silver bullet, and that they can have this strategic backlash, like in those populations that are mourning situations like that. My bigger concern, because those errors are sort of inevitable in the messiness of war, but my bigger concern is the violent non-state actor use, because they are not ethically or normatively constrained the same way that states are. They don't have the same accountability structures. So they tend to use UAS with much less discrimination or care. One example is in the Libya civil war. This was when the LNA and the GNA were really thickly in combat to establish who would be the state leader. The LNA had several heavy drones donated by other states, and they were using them quite indiscriminately. In fact, there is a statistic that 60% of civilian deaths occurred from indiscriminate drone strikes by a violent non-state actor. So that concerns me more than the occasional error, which has reputational costs for states, and so they have incentives to avoid them. And as tragic as they are, hopefully they're not common.
And we have a comment from someone called MJ, and they are really talking exactly about this. They've commented here, even though experts say drones are super precise, mistakes in targeting or intelligence often lead to a lot of harm for the non-combatants there.
And Nick Connelly, I guess you must be seeing some similar things in Ukraine where mistaken targets are hit on both sides of the war.
Sure, there are constant reports of civilians getting caught up, trying to get out of their kind of frontline villages, homes, and losing their lives on the way. Has to be said that isn't restricted to drone attacks, right? You have the same situation with artillery attacks, with air attacks. As long as basically there is a human being that is pressing the button and following this, it doesn't really matter what kind of weapon it is, you will have mistakes made or made on purpose, as some Ukrainians would allege when it comes to Russian attacks. I think the bigger question is then when we move towards more AI and an algorithm choosing and identifying targets, that's then the kind of bigger, newer question of how reliable they are and how many mistakes they are going to make compared to human operators.
It's like you were reading my mind, Nick, because that very beautifully takes us into AI. We can't talk about ethics of drone warfare unless we talk about technology and what is happening in the future. And, of course, AI. Kerry, you've already touched on that. In fact, both of you have touched on that. But where do you think the development of these drones is going? I mean, what are we likely to see in the next decade or so?
I think that's a very difficult question a decade out, because the technology is changing so quickly that the futurism is sketchy even 2 to 3 years out, how it might look. But right now, for your viewers' benefit, there is examples of artificial intelligence being added into warfare. We call it algorithmic warfare. But currently, humans are still either in the loop, meaning that they are centrally figured in the decision process to actually neutralize a target, or they're on the loop, meaning that they are monitoring those decisions and they can intervene at any moment. The big question that I think Nick is bringing up is when their humans are off the loop, and what we call a kill chain from target identification all the way to neutralization is solely done through an artificial intelligence. And that's what the colloquial killer robots is often talking about. I think that is going to be a choice, and that states have an onus to lead right now in this, because we are at a crossroad. Are we going to permit fully algorithmic warfare, and what are the implications of that? And I think most scholars would say that there always needs to be a human at least on the loop. And those norms are being forged right now in a lot of venues, including among states that disagree about the strategic imperative that we shouldn't be constrained by such things. But I would love to hear Nick's perspective on this as well, because it is possible, and I think it's only constrained by our choices and our ethical commitments.
Nick.
Well, in that segment we saw from the report from Avdiivka from last winter, if you see the full report, there is a kind of longer episode where lots of drones are lost because of miscommunication between the person operating the reconnaissance drone and the people flying the FPV drones. So those are the kind of most obvious next steps to basically share all that information in a way that it's not a matter of one person saying to someone else in a cold trench, you need to turn right after that tree. That is obviously a kind of very obvious next step. As for kind of total automation or automatic kill chains, I haven't heard of anything of that kind happening in Ukraine. Obviously, they're not going to be telling me first off, but there is a lot of innovation here. You constantly meet people who are coming up with new systems. Ukraine was very strong in IT even before this war, and now lots of those best brains are working on AI technology, especially for drones, because this is a country that is outgunned in conventional systems by Russia very significantly, and it is the hope here that they can use their innovation to try and balance out that kind of discrepancy between Russian and Ukrainian power on the battlefield, and also use drones to save Ukrainian soldiers' lives, right? Rather than forcing someone to go out of a trench with a gun, get a machine to do that and lose that machine rather than losing a human life. So I think here in Ukraine, increasingly there is a sense that people are willing to take risks and to ignore the kind of maybe ethical questions if they think that can save the lives of people who've been called up to fight.
And that whole idea of ignoring the ethical questions, I mean, that is a big one, isn't it, Kerry?
It is, and Nick, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. I just recently saw that there is an AI application now. Those FPV drones, in the last moment before they impact on a human target, is where it's the most difficult for an operator. And there is now an AI application that in the last moments, humans still on the loop, they automate the targeting, especially for humans who are in movement. So that is one example of it being used for targeting in the Ukraine theater. But I agree with you that for the most part, AI will be used to economize data and to shorten some of the intelligence analysis, and it won't be used as killer robots. That's something that we certainly need to stay on the leading edge of. But I agree that for the most part, it won't be used for those more concerning ethical applications.
I think probably I need to let you go, Kerry, but before you do, I'd just like to put the question to you that we are asking today on News Desk. How are drones shifting the power balance in warfare, conflict and global security? Now, I know it's a huge question, but are you able to answer that and give us a couple of your thoughts about where you think it is going?
I can give it a try, even though it's a large question. I think the truth is, with any emerging technology or tactic, technique, and procedure like we're seeing, the long-term implications are unknown. That's what's so fascinating about studying an emerging phenomenon, is that it's dynamic and we have to map it in real time. But I think that we should consider this in time scopes. In the short term, this innovation favors the bold and daring innovating actors, including the non-state actors, and it favors those who are going to take that offensive advantage. Over time, I think the more powerful actors are going to have the opportunity to observe and get a handle and probably become preeminent in it. So in the long term, I expect that this is going to follow a very classical offense-defense dialectic. Right now, we're in that short term where the offensive advantage problematizes international security and conflict. So there are many states racing right now to assimilate these capabilities so that they aren't caught on their heels the way Russia was in the beginning of this conflict when Ukraine surprised them with this capacity. And because of how central it is to so many actors' calculus, I expect that it's going to normalize fairly quickly and that we're going to see a bloom of counter-UAS options that are hopefully effective in different settings and also sustainable in terms of cost, so that we don't have that asymmetric attrition between offense and defense.
Dr. Kerry Chavez, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your insights and thank you for your time. I hope you have a good morning, because I know that you are quite a few hours behind us here in Berlin. We really appreciate it. That's Dr. Kerry Chavez, international security expert, joining us from the United States. Many thanks. We still have...
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And we still have Nick Connelly with us, who I know has to go very shortly too, because he has more commitments. I'd just love to get your final thoughts, Nick, on what we're talking about here, this whole idea of how drones are shifting the power balance.
Well, I think it allows the weaker, poorer, less kind of institutionalized side, in this case Ukraine, to push back on its enemies, right, that have the more conventional, expensive, complicated weapon systems. And it's also kind of really interesting to think about in economic terms, right? So you've got these Iranian-built Shahed drones that the Russians are using, attacking Ukraine pretty much every night. And earlier on in the war, Ukraine was using more sophisticated kind of interceptor missiles to knock them out of the sky. And the maths just doesn't stack up. These Shahed drones are believed to cost a couple of tens of thousands of dollars at most, and the weapons they were using to shoot them down were significantly more expensive. So in recent weeks here in Kiev, we've been hearing machine gun fire at night, which is pretty disconcerting for lots of people. Lots of people thinking, what's happening? Are we unable to shoot them down? And they are basically letting these drones come a bit closer to try and shoot them down cheaply with a bullet rather than sending a missile up to get them down. So you're seeing the kind of strategies change as this war continues, and Ukraine trying to hold on to its more expensive interceptors for the kinds of missiles that a machine gun won't be able to stop.
Nick, thank you very much. We will let you go because I know that you've got another interview coming up. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it, and I hope that we will speak again soon on News Desk.
Thanks.
A fascinating conversation. We've whipped through it, haven't we, with what the different types of drones, small to enormous, how it's changed particularly during over the past 2.5 years with the Ukraine war, and what the future looks like. And then when you're talking about non-state actors and terrorists and,
What Kerry Chavez was saying there about that AI technology was pretty shocking, how it's so advanced that it can, at the last minute, just sort of take over and find its moving target.
Find the target, yeah.
I mean, it's sobering.
It is. And the purpose of the conversation is not to scare you all, but to inform you, which is why we're here. Before we do go, though, we have the results of today's poll. Cherry, what have you got?
So let me just repeat the poll question. That is, what's your biggest concern about the use of drones in warfare? We've got 193 votes, so thank you all for voting. Most of the people, 43% that is, voted for the risk of abuse by non-state actors. 17% voted for the lack of accountability. 25% voted for dehumanization of conflict, and 13% voted for targeting mistakes.
And the non-state actor concern is exactly what Dr. Kerry Chavez was warning about and what she said she was most concerned about, wasn't it? So it's an interesting poll. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you, by the way, around the table. Thank you very much to everyone who has joined us on this stream. Thank you for your comments.
Yes, and we will be putting up next week's topic for News Desk around a day before the stream begins. So do go to the DW News YouTube page to find that out. We really do appreciate all your comments and questions. Thank you so much for keeping them in today, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week. Bye-bye.